The great miracle of the 20th century is electricity. If the printing press is the brain of civilization and the steam engine is its heart, electric wires are its nervous system. Steam is a giant. Electricity is a witch. There is something uncanny about it. Man writes volumes about electricity, calls it positive and negative, and measures it in ohms and volts. Gives courses to explain it in his schools and universities. Kills criminals, cures the sick, and scatters darkness with it. Makes it whirl him through space. Compels it to bear his whisper through hundreds of miles, and can make it fly around the entire earth with his written word. And yet no man knows what electricity is. Electricity exists, and has always existed, from the back of a cat to the infinite arch of the sky. 100 years ago, practically nothing was known of electricity. Persons now living were born into a world that had never seen an electric telegraph, a telephone, an electric car, or an electric light. We are living in the morning of electrical knowledge, and what the day may bring no one can imagine. Americans have given the world many of the greatest inventions, and in the field of electricity, they have given it nearly everything of value. It is to American ingenuity that civilization is indebted for the electrical telegraph, the submarine cable, the telephone, the electric light, and the electric car. The names of Morse, Vail, Field, Bell, Brush, Gray, Edison, and Sprague, all American electrical inventors, will always be prominent in the list of the world's great benefactors. If you will rub a stick of sealing wax briskly with a woolen cloth, you will find that the stick of wax will attract to itself bits of bran, small shreds of paper, and the like. This is the simplest experiment in electricity. In the same way, by rubbing amber with silk, Thales, a Greek philosopher who lived in the 6th century before Christ, is thought to have discovered electricity. The Greek word for amber is electron. Because of the supposed discovery of electricity in amber by Thales, the English word electricity was coined and used for the first time by William Gilbert, a British physician and scientist who lived during the reigns of Elizabeth and James. For nearly 25 centuries, reaching from the time of Thales to the opening of the 19th century, the world learned practically nothing about electricity. The start in modern electrical knowledge was made by Galvani, an Italian scientist, born in 1737, who just before the last century dawn showed that electricity can be produced by the contact of metals with fluids. The term galvanic, used in connection with electricity, comes from the name of this investigator. Galvani's experiments suggested the electric battery to Volta, another Italian scientist who was born in 1745. The electrical word voltaic is in honor of Volta. In 1752, Benjamin Franklin flew his kite into the thunderstorm and proved that lightning is electricity. A little later, Hans Christian Ørsted, a Danish investigator, pointed out the relation between electricity and magnetism. In the early part of the 19th century, Michael Faraday, an eminent English physicist, discovered the possibility of producing electric currents through the motion of a magnet. Faraday's discovery led to the electric dynamo machine, the source of modern power over electricity. The oldest and greatest of electrical inventions is the telegraph. Tele is a Greek adverb meaning afar. Graph comes from the Greek verb to write. Telegraph therefore means to write afar. The idea of telegraphic communication is more than 2.5 centuries old. In 1632, Galileo referred to a secret art of communicating at great distances by means of magnetic needles. In 1753, there appeared in the Scots magazine an article signed C.M., since ascertained to have been Charles Morrison of Greenock in Scotland, setting forth a fairly clear idea of the electric telegraph. Joseph Henry, of Washington, D.C., in 1831 signaled through an electrical circuit a mile in length. The first commercially successful telegraph was devised in 1837 by Samuel F. B. Morse, an American. Samuel Finley Breeze Morse was born in Charlestown, Massachusetts, April 27, 1791. He was educated in the common schools of his native town and in Yale University, where he was graduated in 1810. After graduation, like Fulton, the inventor of the steamboat, he went to Europe to study art and became successful as an artist. On his return to America in 1832, one of his fellow passengers on the ship was Charles T. Jackson, who had been studying electricity in Paris. Jackson told Morse of some experiments in electricity which the French had been making, and remarked that it would be a good thing if news could be transmitted through long distances by electricity. Morse replied, "Why can't it be done?" From that hour, he gave his time and energy to the invention of the electric telegraph. During the remainder of the voyage, he drew plans for apparatus and tried to devise an electric alphabet. In 1837, he put two instruments at the ends of a short line through which he sent and received messages. About this time, he met a man who was destined to be of great service to him in promoting his invention, and one who deserves almost as much credit for it as Morse himself. This was Alfred Vail. Vail was born at Morristown, New Jersey, September 25, 1807. He was a son of Stephen Vail, the wealthy owner of the Speedwell Iron Works. One day in September 1837, after Morse had completed his apparatus, he was invited to exhibit it at the University of the City of New York. Alfred Vail was a student in the university at the time and was one of the spectators to whom the apparatus was exhibited. He was much impressed with it. Morse needed money, and Alfred Vail's father had it. Morse was invited to the home of the Vails in Speedwell, where the matter of the invention was talked over. The sum of $2,000 was necessary to get the invention started. Stephen Vail agreed to furnish the money. Alfred Vail was to construct apparatus and exhibit it to Congress. For this, he was to have 1/4 of the proceeds arising from the patent. Alfred Vail set to work to construct the apparatus. A room in his father's factory was set apart for this purpose. William Baxter, a bright mechanic employed in the iron shops, was chosen to assist him. As secrecy was required for the work, the room was kept locked. For several months, Vail and Baxter occupied together the locked room, sharing each other's confidence and each other's elation or disappointment as the work went well or ill. On January 6, 1838, Baxter, without hat or coat, rushed to the elder Vail's residence to announce that the apparatus was completed. Mr. Vail had become discouraged. However, he went to see the trial of the apparatus. He found his son at one end of the 3 miles of wire that was stretched around the room, and Morse at the other. After a short explanation had been made to him, he wrote on a piece of paper, "A patient waiter is no loser." He then said to his son, "If you can send this, and Mr. Morse can read it at the other end, I shall be convinced." The message was sent and read at the other end of the wire. The apparatus was taken to Washington, where it created not only wonder but excitement. In September 1837, Morse filed an application for a patent on his invention. In December of the same year, he failed in his effort to secure from Congress an appropriation for an experimental line which he proposed to build between Washington and Baltimore. In May 1838, he went to Europe seeking aid. The governments there refused him funds or patents. In May 1839, he returned to the United States and began an heroic struggle for recognition. During this period, he often suffered for the barest necessities of life. Sometimes he could afford but a single meal in 24 hours. Finally, after repeated disappointments, when Morse himself had almost given up hope, the House of Representatives of the 27th Congress, on the last night of its session, March 3, 1843, by a vote of 90 to 82, appropriated $30,000 for building a trial line between Washington and Baltimore. After the bill had passed the House, the outlook for its passage in the Senate was not bright. One senator who was favorable to the bill advised Morse to give it up, return home, and think no more of it. The bill had been made the object of opposition and ridicule. One prominent official, to show his contempt for the project, proposed that half the amount asked for should be used in mesmeric experiments. Morse, believing that the Senate would defeat the appropriation, went to his lodging place to retire for the night. He found that after paying the amount he owed at the hotel, he would have less than 40 cents left. Early the next morning, information reached him that a little before midnight the Senate had passed the bill. Apparent failure had turned into victory. The fight was won. Work was begun at once. On April 30th, the line reached Annapolis Junction, 22 miles from Washington, and was operated with satisfactory results. May 1st, 1844, was the date upon which the Whig convention was to assemble in Baltimore to nominate the candidates of that party for president and vice president. It was arranged between Morse and Vail that the latter should obtain from the passengers upon the afternoon train from Baltimore to Washington, when it stopped at Annapolis Junction. information of the proceedings of the convention and transmit it at once to Morse at the Capitol in Washington. The train arrived at 3:30, and from the passengers, among whom were many of the delegates to the convention, Mr. Vail ascertained that the convention had assembled, nominated the candidates, and adjourned. This information he at once dispatched to Morse, with whom was gathered a number of prominent men who had been invited to be present. Morse sat awaiting the prearranged signal from Vail, when suddenly there came from the instrument the understood clicking, and as the mechanism started, unwinding the ribbon of paper upon which came the embossed dots and dashes. The complete success of the telegraph over 22 miles of wire was established. Slowly came the message. When it had ended, Morse rose and said, "Gentlemen, the convention has adjourned. The train bearing that information has just left Annapolis Junction for Washington, and Mr. Vail has telegraphed me the ticket nominated, and it is," he hesitated, holding in his hand the final proof of victory over space. It is Clay and Frelinghuysen." "You are quizzing us," was the quiet remark. "It's easy enough for you to guess that Clay is at the head of the ticket, but Frelinghuysen, who is Frelinghuysen?" "I only know," was the dignified answer, "that it is the name Mr. Vail has sent to me from Annapolis Junction, where he had the news 5 minutes ago from the train bound this way bearing the delegates." At that time, the 22 miles from the junction to Washington required an hour and a quarter for the fastest trains, and long before the train reached Washington, the newsboys, enterprising even in those days, had their extras upon the streets, their headings by telegraph, telling the story, and being the first time that such a legend had ever appeared upon a printed sheet. A great and enthusiastic crowd greeted the delegates as they alighted from the train at the station. They were struck dumb with astonishment when they heard the people hurrahing for Clay and Frelinghuysen, and saw in cold type before their very eyes the information which they supposed was exclusively their own, but which had preceded them by telegraph. They had asked Mr. Vail at the junction what he was doing when they saw him working the telegraph key, and when he told them, they joked about it most glibly, for no one had any belief in the success of the telegraph. By May 23rd, the entire line was completed from Washington to Baltimore. On the next day, May 24th, 1844, Morse from Washington sent to Vail at Baltimore the first message ever sent over the completed wire. "What hath God wrought?" This famous message was dictated by Miss Ellsworth, daughter of the Commissioner of Patents at that time. She had taken a keen interest in the success of the bill appropriating the $30,000 for the experiment, and was the first to convey to Morse the news that the bill had passed. Morse thereupon gave Miss Ellsworth his promise that the first message to pass over the line should be dictated by her. A bit of the original wire and the receiver that Vail used at Baltimore are now preserved in the National Museum in Washington. The transmitter used by Morse at the Washington end of the line has been lost. Morse lived to see his system of telegraphy adopted by the United States, France, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Russia, and Australia. 95% of all telegraphy is by his system. He finally received a large fortune from his invention. Unlike Columbus, Morse was honored in his lifetime for his achievement. Foreign nations bestowed upon him honors and medals, and in August 1858, a convention of European powers called by Napoleon III at Paris gave Morse 400,000 francs, about $80,000, as a testimonial of his services to civilization. In October 1842, he laid the first submarine telegraph line. It was across the harbor of New York. Later, he assisted Peter Cooper and Cyrus W. Field in their efforts to lay the first Atlantic cable. Honored by all the civilized world, he died in New York City April 2, 1872. 13 years earlier, Vail had died at his home in Morristown, New Jersey. In the Morse system, the alphabet is represented by combinations of dots and dashes. The dots denote short currents of electricity flowing through the wire, the dashes, longer ones. Credit for the alphabet really belongs to Vail. Morse had devised a somewhat complicated system, but Vail invented the dots and dashes. He discovered that E and T are the most frequently used letters. He denoted E by one dot, or one short current. T he indicated by one dash, or one long current. The other letters are denoted by dots and dashes, as A, one dot and one dash, B, one dash and three dots, etc. In 1838, Steinheil, a German investigator, contributed an important element to the practical operation of the electric telegraph by discovering that the Earth could take the place of the return wire, which up to that time had been deemed necessary to complete the circuit. At first, only one message could be sent over a wire at a time. Now several messages may be transmitted in opposite directions over the same wire at the same time. Wireless telegraphy is based on the principle discovered and announced by the English scientist Michael Faraday, that heat, light, and electricity are transmitted by ether waves, and that these ether waves permeate all space. The first to demonstrate the practical operation of wireless telegraphy was Guglielmo Marconi, an Italian. In 1890, he undertook experiments to prove his theory that the electric current readily passes through any substance, and when once started in a given direction follows a direct course without the aid of a conductor. Marconi made the first practical demonstration of wireless telegraphy in 1896. In March 1899, he sent a wireless message across the English Channel from France to England. In December 1901, he began his first experiments in wireless telegraphy across the Atlantic. In December of the following year, the first official transatlantic wireless message was sent. Now, wireless telegraphic messages are sent regularly to and from moving ships in mid-ocean and across the 3,000 miles of the Atlantic between Europe and America. One of the most striking illustrations of the power of perseverance is the successful struggle of Cyrus West Field in laying the Atlantic cable. Mr. Field was born in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, November 30th, 1819. His schooling, which was slight, was secured in his native town. When he was 15 years old, he secured a position in a business house in New York City at a salary of $50 a year. He subsequently founded a prosperous business in the manufacture and sale of paper. In 1854, Mr. Field's attention was directed to an attempt to lay an electric cable at Newfoundland, which had failed for want of funds. The idea of laying a cable across the Atlantic occurred to him. He laid his plans before a number of prominent citizens of New York. On 4 successive evenings, they met at his home to study the project, and they finally decided to undertake it. On May 6, 1854, a company was organized to lay the cable, with Peter Cooper as president. The next 12 years, Field devoted exclusively to the cable. He went to England 30 times. The first cable was brought from England and was to be laid across the Gulf of St. Lawrence. 40 miles had been successfully laid when a storm arose and the cable was cut in order to save the ship. Then came a year's delay. Meantime, the bottom of the sea was being explored and a vast tableland was discovered stretching from Newfoundland to Ireland. Field went to England, where he had little difficulty in organizing a company, and work was then begun on the construction of a new cable. Next, he laid his enterprise before Congress and asked for money. An appropriation bill was finally passed in the Senate by a majority of 1 and was signed by President Pierce on March 3, 1857, the day before he retired from office. Field returned to England to superintend the construction of the cable and to make preparations for laying it. At last it was ready, tested, and coiled on the ship. On August 11, 1857, the 6th day out, after 335 miles had been laid, the cable parted. Lord Clarendon, in an interview with Field, had remarked, "But suppose you don't succeed? Suppose you make the attempt and fail. Your cable is lost in the sea. Then what will you do?" The reply came promptly, "Charge it to profit and loss, and go to work to lay another." Lord Clarendon was so well pleased with the reply that he pledged his aid. The loss of 335 miles of cable was the loss of $500,000. Field came back to America and secured from the Secretary of the Navy the vessels needed for another trial. On June 10, 1858, the United States steam frigate Niagara, then the largest in the world, and the British ship Agamemnon set out from opposite shores, bound for mid-ocean. The vessels met, and the 2 sections of the cable were spliced. Then they began laying it toward both shores at the same time. After a little more than 100 miles had been laid, this cable parted in mid-ocean, and Field hurried to London to meet the discouraged directors. On July 17th, the ships set sail again for mid-ocean. The cable was spliced in 1,500 fathoms of water, and again the ships started for opposite shores. Field was on the Niagara headed toward Newfoundland. Scarcely anyone looked for success. Field was the only man who kept up courage through this trying period. On August 5, 1858, he telegraphed the safe arrival of the ship at Newfoundland. The shore ends of the cable were laid, and on August 16 a message from Queen Victoria of England to President Buchanan flashed under the sea. There was great excitement everywhere. The two worlds had been tied together with a strange electric nerve. On the evening of the 1st of September, a great ovation was tendered field in New York. National salutes were fired, processions were formed, there was an address by the mayor, and late at night a great banquet. While the banquet was in progress, the cable parted. Everyone except Field was disheartened. He went to work again, and during the next 5 years, the long years of the Civil War, he labored unceasingly. A larger cable with a greater resisting force was made. On the 23rd of July, 1865, the steamship Great Eastern began another attempt to lay the cable. When it was within 600 miles of Newfoundland, the cable parted again. For 9 days attempts were made, in 2.5 miles of water, to grapple the cable, splice it, and continue the work of laying it. 3 times the cable was grappled, but the apparatus on the ship was not strong enough to hoist it aboard. Still, Field never faltered. Another British company was formed and another cable was constructed. The Great Eastern was again loaded and on July 13th, a Friday, set sail westward laying the cable. After an uncertain voyage of 2 weeks, the Great Eastern arrived at Newfoundland, and the undertaking had again been successfully accomplished. Field telegraphed his arrival as follows. Parts content, July 27, 1866. We arrived here at 9 o'clock this morning. All well. Thank God, the cable is laid and is in perfect working order. Cyrus W. Field. 12 years of unfaltering perseverance had won. Honors were heaped upon Field. Congress voted him a gold medal and the thanks of the nation. The Prime Minister of Great Britain declared that only the fact of his being the citizen of another nation prevented his receiving the highest honors in the power of the British government to bestow. The Paris Exposition Universelle of 1867 honored him with the Grand Medal, the highest prize it had to give. Mr. Field was afterward interested in the laying of cables connecting Europe, India, China, Australia, the West Indies, and South America. In 1880 to 81, he made a trip around the world, full of satisfaction in his own part in making a new era of the world's civilization. He died at his home in New York on July 11, 1892. The effect of the electric telegraph on government, intelligence, and civilization in general can scarcely be overstated. Sidney Smith, writing to Earl Grey after the admission of California into the United States, said that this marked an end to the great American Republic. For how could people with such diversified interests, with such natural barriers, hold together? He did not foresee how strongly a fine copper wire could bind together the two seaboards and the great plains of the interior. Without the electric telegraph, neither the great daily newspaper nor the modern operation of railroads would be possible. It wipes away the natural boundaries of nations and makes neighbors of all men. In 1819, Sir Charles Wheatstone, an English physicist, invented an instrument popularly known as the magic lyre, but which he called the telephone. The first part of this word is the same Greek adverb tele that is found in telegraph. The phone is from another Greek word meaning to sound. To telephone, therefore, means to sound afar. The use of the English word telephone by Wheatstone is historically the first appearance of the word in our language. His device did nothing but reproduce music by means of sounding boards. The inventor of the modern telephone is Alexander Graham Bell. Mr. Bell was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, March 3, 1847. His father was Alexander Melville Bell, a Scotch educator, inventor of a system of visible speech, and author of some textbooks on elocution. His grandfather was Alexander Bell, noted for his efforts to remove impediments of speech. Alexander Graham Bell was therefore well fitted by heredity for the invention of an instrument to transmit speech. He was educated in the Edinburgh High School and in the University of Edinburgh, and in 1867 he entered the University of London. Hard study broke down his health, and he moved to Canada. Thence he moved to the United States, becoming first a teacher of deaf mutes, and afterward professor of vocal physiology in Boston University. In 1874, at the suggestion of the Boston Board of Education, he began some experiments to show to the eye the vibrations of sound for the use of the deaf and dumb. The results of these experiments convinced Bell that articulate speech could be transmitted through space. Early in 1876, he completed the first telephone. The same year, he exhibited it at the Centennial Exposition at Philadelphia, where it was pronounced the wonder of wonders. He filed application for a patent on his invention at the Patent Office in Washington, February 14, 1876. It is a singular fact that another application for a patent on the telephone was received at the Patent Office a few hours later on the same day from Elisha Gray, an electrical inventor of Chicago. The patent was issued to Bell, not because his invention was superior in merit to Gray's, but on the ground that his application was received first. This is a case where the early bird catches the worm, for the profits arising from the patent have made Mr. Bell very wealthy, and high honors have come to him as the inventor of one of the world's greatest and most marvelous inventions. The Bell Telephone Company was organized in 1877, and in 1878 the first telephone exchanges were constructed. By the following year, the telephone was firmly established as a social and commercial necessity. It has grown with great rapidity. It is now found in every city of the world. Hotels, large buildings, and ships have their private exchanges, and it has found its way recently into thousands of farmhouses. Bell had to fight hard in the courts to sustain his patent. Suit after suit was brought by rival claimants, attacking his right to the patent. The litigation was bitter and protracted. One of the most noteworthy of these suits was brought by a Pennsylvania mechanic named Drawbaugh. He claimed that about 1872 he had made a working telephone out of a cigar box, a glass tumbler, a tin can, and some other crude materials, and that with the apparatus thus constructed, he had talked over a wire several hundred feet long. Many persons testified that they were acquainted with Drawbaugh's apparatus, some of them having used it. Some instruments, said to be the original ones which Drawbaugh had constructed, were brought into court and exhibited. It was shown that speech could be transmitted with them in a crude way. Drawbaugh claimed that he was too poor at the time of making the apparatus to take out the necessary patent. The court decided in favor of Bell. Elisha Gray, whose application for a patent had been received the same day that Bell's was, also brought suit against Bell. Before making his application, Gray had filed some preliminary papers looking forward to a patent on the telephone. In his suit against Bell, he charged that the patent examiner had fraudulently and secretly conveyed to Bell the contents of those papers. But Bell won this suit, and he finally established over all rivals his legal title as the inventor of the telephone. Recently, a wireless system of telephoning has been in process of development, and it will not be strange if, within a few years, we shall be talking through space without wires. So boundless seem the possibilities of the age. Let's start with a new story of the steam engine. The most powerful and important mass of matter on the Earth is the steam engine. It is the throbbing heart of civilization, even as the printing press is its brain. It would be difficult for man to compute his debt to steam. Upon it he relies for food, clothing, and shelter, the three necessities for which the race has always striven, and without it he could have scarcely any of life's comforts and luxuries. Steam is the mistress of commerce, manufacturing, and mining, and the servant of agriculture. Steam gives employment to millions of men. It plants cities and towns in waste places. It enables man to leave the little valley or hillside where his fathers lived, and makes of him a citizen of the world. It lessens the power of time and space, and makes neighbors of ocean-divided continents. It would not be easy for men living in the 20th century to imagine a society uninfluenced by the use of steam, but nearly all of man's life on the earth has been passed without its help. Fire and water, the two productive factors of steam, have always existed, but it was not until a few score of years ago that man learned to put them together successfully and to produce the greatest force known to civilization. In the few years since its discovery, it has spread to every nook and corner of civilization. Suppose you could ascend to some great height, whence you could see working at one time all the steam-driven machinery in the world. What a sight it would be! What if the noise from all this machinery, the screech of the speeding locomotive, the hum and roar of factory and mill, the hoarse yell of ships, and the puffing of mine engines, should reach your ear at once? What a sound it would be! The idea of using steam for driving stationary machinery originated in the early centuries. This was the first use to which steam was put. For a long time, no one seems to have thought of using it for transportation purposes. As far back as 130 BC, we find mention of heat engines, which employed steam as their motive power and were used for organ blowing, the turning of spits, and like purposes. But from this early date till the 17th century, practically no progress was made in the use of steam. Though men had experimented with steam up to this time with more or less success, the world is chiefly indebted for the developed type of the steam engine to James Watt and George Stephenson. Watt was born in Greenock, Scotland, January 19, 1736. He was a poor boy, and early in life he was thrown upon his own resources. During his youth he struggled against ill health. For days at a time, he was prostrated with severe headaches. But he was bright, determined, and had a genial disposition that made him many friends. When he was 21 years old, he secured a position as maker of scientific instruments for the university in Glasgow. He began discussing with some scientific friends at the university the possibility of improving the steam engine, which at that time was used only for pumping water, chiefly in the drainage of mines. He entered upon a scientific study of the properties of steam and tried to devise means for making the steam engine more useful. One Sunday afternoon early in 1765, while walking in Glasgow, the idea he had studied so long to evolve suddenly flashed into his mind. Without delay, Watt put his plan to the test and found that it worked. For a long time, owing to a lack of money, he had difficulty in establishing the merits of his improvements. Finally, he formed a partnership with Matthew Boulton, a wealthy and energetic man who lived at Birmingham, England. They began the manufacture of steam engines at Birmingham under the firm name of Boulton and Watt. This partnership was very successful. Watt supplied the inventions. Boulton furnished the money and attended to the business. Before the time of Watt, the steam engine was exclusively a steam pump, slow, cumbrous, wasteful of fuel, and very little used. What made it a quick, powerful, and efficient engine, requiring only a fourth as much fuel as before. Under his first patent, the engine was still used only as a steam pump, but his later improvements adapted it for driving stationary machinery of all kinds and, save in a few respects, left it essentially what it is today. Prior to Watt's inventions, the mines of Great Britain were far from thriving. Many were even on the point of being abandoned, through the difficulty of removing the large quantities of water that collected in them. His improvements made it possible to remove this water at a moderate cost, and this gave many of the mines a new lease of life. The commercial success of his engine was soon fully established. Watt paid practically no attention to the use of steam for purposes of transportation. In one of his patents, he described a steam locomotive, but he offered little encouragement when his chief assistant, Murdoch, who was the inventor of gas lighting, made experiments with steam for locomotion. The notion then was to use a steam carriage on ordinary roads. Railroads had not been thought of. When the idea of using steam on railways began to take shape in the later days of Watt, he refused to encourage the plan. It is said that he even put a clause in a lease of his house, providing that no steam carriage should ever approach it under any pretext whatever. Besides developing the steam engine, Watt made other inventions, including a press for copying letters. He also probably discovered the chemical composition of water. He died at Heathfield, England, on the 19th of August, 1819. It is denied many men to see the magnitude of their achievements. Moses died on Pisgah, in sight of the promised land, toward which for 40 years he had led the children of Israel through the wilderness. Wolfe gave up his life on the plains of Quebec just as the first shouts of the routed French greeted his ears. Columbus was sent home in chains from the America he had discovered, not dreaming he had given to civilization another world. Lincoln's eyes were closed forever at the very dawn of peace, after he had watched in patience through the long and fearful night of the Civil War. It never appeared to James Watt that the idea which flashed into his mind that Sunday afternoon while he was walking in the streets of Glasgow would transform human life. That like a mighty multiplier it would increase the product of man's power and give him dominion, not over the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air, but over tide and wind, space and time. Victor Hugo calls locomotives these giant draft horses of civilization. But man never harnessed these wonderful iron animals until the time of George Stephenson, less than 100 years ago. Stephenson was born at Wylam, near Newcastle, England, June 9, 1781. His father was a fireman of a coal mine engine at that place. In boyhood, George was a cowherd, but he spent his spare time making clay models of engines and other objects of a mechanical nature. When he was 14 years old, he became assistant to his father in firing the engine at the colliery, and 3 years later, he was advanced to engine driving. At this time, he could not even read, but, stimulated by a strong desire to know more of the engines made by Boulton and Watt, he began in his 18th year to attend a night school. He learned rapidly. During most of this time, he studied various experiments with a view to making a successful steam locomotive. Modern railways had their origin in roads called tramways, which were used for hauling coal from the mines of England to the sea. At first, ordinary dirt roads were used for this purpose, but as the heavy traffic wore these roads away, it became the practice to place planks or timbers at the bottoms of the ruts. Afterwards, wooden rails were laid straight and parallel on the level surface. The rails were oak scantlings held together with crossed timbers of the same material, fastened by means of large oak pins. Later, strips of iron were nailed on the tops of the wooden rails. Over these rails, bulky, four-wheeled carts loaded with coal were pulled by horses. Stephenson made what he called a traveling engine for the tramways leading from the mines where he worked to the sea, 9 miles distant. He named his engine My Lord. On July 25, 1814, he made a successful trial trip with it. The successful use of steam in hauling coal from the mines led thoughtful persons to consider its use for carrying merchandise and passengers. At this time, freight was transported inland by means of canals. This method was slow. 36 hours were required for traveling 50 miles. Passengers were conveyed by coaches drawn by horses. In 1821, a railroad for the transportation of merchandise and passengers was opened between Stockton and Darlington in England. The line, including 3 branches, was 38 miles long. The plan was to use animal power on this road, but George Stephenson secured permission to try on it his steam locomotive. In September 1825, the first train passed over the road. It consisted of 34 cars weighing, all told, 90 tons. The train was pulled by Stephenson's engine, operated by Stephenson himself, with a signalman riding on horseback in advance. The train moved off at the rate of 10 or 12 miles an hour, and on certain parts of the road it reached a speed of 15 miles per hour. The trial was a complete success. The road had been built chiefly for the transportation of freight, but from the first passengers insisted on being carried, and in October 1825, the company began to run a daily passenger coach called the Experiment. This coach carried 6 persons inside and from 15 to 20 outside. The round trip between Stockton and Darlington was made in 2 hours. A fare of 1 shilling was charged, and each passenger was allowed 14 pounds of baggage free. The Stockton and Darlington was the first railway in the world over which passengers and freight were hauled by steam. Stephenson was next employed to help construct a railway between Liverpool and Manchester. The most eminent engineers of the day predicted that the road could not be built, but it was built. On the 15th of September, 1830, Stephenson made a trial trip over the road with an improved locomotive named the Rocket. On the trial trip, the Rocket made 29 miles an hour. This trip firmly proved the possibilities of steam as motive power on railways and started the modern era of railroad building. Other railways were quickly built, and soon they radiated from London to nearly every English seaport. Stephenson's son, Robert, assisted him in the construction of the Rocket and later attained considerable reputation as an engineer. It is claimed that George Stephenson was the inventor of the safety lamp for use in mines, an invention usually accredited to Sir Humphrey Davy. He was often consulted in the building of subsequent railroads, but he spent the last years of his life in farming and gardening at his home at Chesterfield, England, where he died August 12, 1848. Before the days of railroads in America, freight was hauled on canals and passengers rode in stagecoaches or on horseback. A coach made the trip from Boston to New York twice a week, and the journey required 6 days. A trip from New York to Philadelphia took 2 days. From Philadelphia to Baltimore, the roads were good, but south of Baltimore they were bad and even dangerous. South of the James River, the traveler was compelled to make his journey on horseback. A coach from Charleston to Savannah was the only public conveyance south of the Potomac River. In the days of the old colonial stagecoach, if a traveler wished to go from Boston to New York, He would have to be ready to begin the journey at 3 o'clock in the morning. The stage had no glass windows, no door or step, and passengers were obliged to climb in at the front. One pair of horses pulled the stage 18 miles, and then they were relieved by another pair. At about 10 o'clock in the evening, after a day's journey of 40 miles, the stage drew up at an inn for the night. At 3 o'clock the next morning, after dressing by the light of a horn lantern, the traveler must resume his journey. If the roads were bad, he might have to alight from the stage and help the driver pull the wheels out of the mud. Rivers were crossed on clumsy flatboats. When the streams were swollen with rains or filled with floating ice, the passage across was often dangerous. The trip from Boston to Philadelphia, which would have taken 8 days of Washington's time, can easily be made now by train in as many hours. In these days of the modern railroad, San Francisco is nearer in time to New York than Washington was scarcely 100 years ago. The first railway in America was built in 1826. It connected a granite quarry at Quincy, Massachusetts, with the town of Milton in the same state. It was only 2 or 3 miles long and was operated with horses. In May 1829, 3 English locomotives, the first ever seen in America, were unloaded at New York City. On August 9th of the same year, one of these engines was tried at Honesdale, Pennsylvania. This was the first time that a locomotive ever turned a wheel on a railway in America. A canal which the businessmen of Philadelphia proposed to construct from their city to Pittsburgh in order to give them access to the trade centers of the West threatened the commercial prosperity of Baltimore. To offset the advantages which this canal would give Philadelphia, at a great public meeting in Baltimore, it was decided to build a railway from Baltimore to some point on the Ohio River. The road was named the Baltimore and Ohio. In 1830, it was finished from Baltimore as far as Ellicott's Mills, a distance of 15 miles. The Baltimore and Ohio was the first railroad in the United States built for the express purpose of carrying passengers and freight. The original intention was to pull cars over this road with horses, but Peter Cooper persuaded the railroad officials to try his engine, Tom Thumb, which he had built in 1829. The trial was successful, for Tom Thumb drew a carload of passengers at the rate of 15 to 18 miles per hour. This engine was the first locomotive built in America, and its trial was the first trip ever made by an American locomotive. The first railroad in the United States constructed with the original purpose of using steam as motive power was the South Carolina Railroad, a line 136 miles long between Charleston and Hamburg. A locomotive built in New York City, called the Best Friend, made its first trip over this road in November 1830. It was the first locomotive to run regularly on a railroad in the United States. Railroad building spread rapidly in America, as it had in England. By 1835, there were 22 railroads in the United States, 2 of them being west of the Alleghenies, though no road was more than 140 miles in length. There was no railroad west of the Mississippi River prior to 1853, and in that year a line only 38 miles long was built. During 1906 alone, 5,516 miles of railroad were constructed in the United States. At the end of that year, there was a total in the United States of 222,635 miles, or nearly enough to reach 9 times around the entire globe. The United States now has 30% more miles of railway main track than all of Europe and contains 2/5 of the railroad mileage of the world. The railroads of the United States represent a value of about $15 billion and give employment to 1.5 million persons. The Pennsylvania Railroad was originally owned by the state. Anyone could use it by paying certain charges, and each person operating the road furnished his own cars, horses, and drivers. There were frequent blockades. When 2 cars going in opposite directions met, one had to turn back. If rival shippers came together and neither was willing to yield to the other, a fight probably settled the rights of precedence. After a time, steam became the sole motive power, and the locomotives were owned by the state. The railroad journeys of our grandfathers were very different from our own. In their day, the rails were wooden beams or stringers laid on horizontal blocks of stone. Strips of iron were fastened with spikes to the tops of the wooden rails. The cars were small, each seating only a few passengers. The locomotive was crude. Its greatest speed was about 15 miles an hour. It could not climb a hill, and when a grade was reached, The cars had to be pulled up or let down with ropes managed by a stationary engine. No cab sheltered the engineer, no brake checked the speed. Sometimes the spikes fastening the iron strips to the tops of the wooden rails worked loose, and these strips curled up and penetrated the bottoms of the cars, greatly to the annoyance and fright of the traveler. The bridges in those days were roofed. The smokestack of the locomotive, being too tall to pass under the roof, was made in two joints or sections fastened together with hinges. When the train approached a bridge, the top section of the stack was lowered. As wood only was used for fuel, the stack emitted a shower of sparks, smoke, and hot cinders. The passengers coughed and sputtered and covered their eyes, mouths, and noses with handkerchiefs. The trip from Chicago to New York is about 1,000 miles, over prairie, river, and mountain. Should you make the journey between these cities over the Pennsylvania Railroad of today, there would be little danger of conflict because two rival trains might want the track at the same time. Nor would you have to wait while ropes pulled the train up a grade, for the locomotive can climb the hills. Instead of the old wooden rails with their strips of iron, there is a double track of solid steel rails all the way. The landscape would fly past you at the rate of a mile a minute, instead of 15 miles an hour. Let us suppose that you leave Chicago at 2:45 o'clock p.m. Central Time. Before the train starts, you could telephone to a friend without leaving the car. You might sit down, in an elegant dining car, to a dinner of all the delicacies the market could afford. You might occupy your own exclusive compartment in a luxuriously equipped Pullman car, lit by electric bulbs, where you could spend the evening reading the magazines, newspapers, and books provided in the train library. You might write at a comfortable desk with train stationery, or dictate letters and telegrams to the train stenographer. You are provided with hot and cold water, bathing facilities, and a barber shop. A maid could be summoned to the service of women and children, and a valet would be in attendance to sponge and press clothing overnight. You would arrive in New York the next morning at 9:45 o'clock, having traveled the 1,000 miles in 18 hours. Simple as the idea of the sleeping car is in reality, it was not introduced until 1858, when the Lakeshore Railroad ran the first crude and uncomfortable night cars. George M. Pullman in 1859 set for himself the task of producing a palace car which should be used for continuous and comfortable travel through long distances by day and night. He remodeled into sleeping cars two passenger coaches belonging to the Chicago and Alton Railroad. Though these cars fell far below the inventor's ideal, they were far in advance of the first makeshifts and in consequence created a demand for more and better cars of the same kind. In 1863, at his factory in Chicago, Pullman began the construction of the Pioneer, the first of the Pullman Palace cars. This car was built at a cost of $18,000. It was first used in the funeral train which conveyed the body of President Lincoln to his burial place in Springfield, Illinois. Few inventions have been financially so remunerative to the inventors as the Pullman Palace car. It brought Mr. Pullman an immense fortune. The Pullman Palace Car Company, founded by Pullman in 1867, is one of the largest and most successful manufacturing concerns in America. It employs a capital of $40 million, gives work to 14,000 persons, furnishes sleeping car service for 120,000 miles of railway, and operates over 2,000 cars. Mr. Pullman adopted plans for the vestibule car in 1887. He died at his home in Chicago, October 19, 1897. The idea of the steamboat did not originate in the brain of Robert Fulton. It is claimed that, as early as 1543, Blasco de Garay propelled a boat by steam, and that in 1707, just 100 years before the time of Fulton's Clermont, Papin ran a boat with steam on a river in Germany. In 1763, William Henry experimented with a steamboat on the Conestoga River in Pennsylvania. James Rumsey, a Scotchman living in Maryland, is said to have been the first American to discover a method for running a vessel with steam against wind and tide. He conceived the idea in August 1783. During 1785, he made his boat, and in 1786 he navigated it on the Potomac River at Shepherdstown, Virginia, in the presence of hundreds of spectators. He wrote to General Washington of his invention, and Washington wrote concerning it to Governor Johnson of Maryland. In 1839, Congress voted a gold medal to James Rumsey, Jr. son and only surviving child of the inventor, in recognition of the elder Rumsey's achievement. In 1787, John Fitch exhibited on the Delaware River a vessel to be propelled by steam, and in 1790, from June to September, he ran a steamboat on that river between Philadelphia and Trenton. But he could not induce the public to patronize his boat, and for lack of business it had to be withdrawn. Some British authorities claimed that the first practical steamboat in the world was the tug Charlotte Dundas, built by William Symington, and tried in 1802 on the Clyde and Forth Canal in Scotland. The trial was successful, but steam towing was abandoned for fear of injuring the banks of the canal. Symington had built a small steamboat that traveled 5 miles an hour in 1788. To Robert Fulton, an American, belongs the credit for placing the steamboat on a successful commercial basis. Fulton was born at Little Britain, Pennsylvania, in 1765. At the age of 17, he adopted the profession of portrait and landscape painter. At 22, he went to England to study art. There he met James Watt, the inventor of the steam engine, and soon he began to give attention to mechanics. In 1793, he started to work on the idea of propelling boats by steam. He made an unsuccessful experiment with a steamboat on the Seine River in France. The vessel sank because its construction was faulty. Fulton returned to America and in New York Harbor began to build another boat, which he named the Catherine of Claremont, shortened to the Claremont. Her engine was procured from Bolton and Watt in England. The boat was 100 feet long and 20 feet wide, weighed 160 tons, and was equipped with side paddle wheels and a sheet iron boiler. As the inventor worked patiently at his task, the newspapers gave him but little notice and the public ridiculed him. The New York legislature had passed a bill granting to Fulton and to Chancellor Livingston the exclusive right to navigate with steamboats the waters of New York State. This bill was a standing subject of ridicule among the legislators at Albany. In August 1807, the Claremont was ready for her trial trip. A large crowd of spectators lined the banks of the Hudson as the boat slowly steamed out into the river. The crowd jeered and hooted and shouted at the vessel their nickname of Fulton's Folly. As the Claremont moved up the river, making slow headway against the current, the crowd changed their jeers to expressions of wonder and finally to cheers. The dry pine wood used for fuel sent out a cloud of thick, black smoke, flames, and sparks, which spread terror among the watermen of the harbor. The Claremont made the voyage from New York up the Hudson to Chancellor Livingston's country estate near Albany, a distance of 110 miles, in 24 hours. The trip was without mishap, and it thoroughly established the practicability of steam for purposes of navigation. Concerning this voyage, Fulton wrote to a friend in Paris, "My steamboat voyage to Albany and back has turned out rather more favorably than I had calculated. The voyage was performed wholly by power of the steam engine. I overtook many sloops and schooners beating to windward, and parted with them as if they had been at anchor. The power of propelling boats by steam is now fully proved. The morning I left New York, there were not 30 persons in the city who believed that the boat would ever move a mile an hour, or be of the least utility. While we were putting off from the wharf, I heard a number of sarcastic remarks. This is the way in which ignorant men compliment what they call philosophers and projectors. I feel infinite pleasure in reflecting on the immense advantages my country will derive from the invention." The Claremont was soon running as a regular packet between New York and Albany. The owners of sailing craft on the river hated her and tried to sink her. The New York legislature passed a bill declaring that any attempt to destroy or injure the Claremont should be a public offense punishable by fine and imprisonment. Then the enemies of the boat applied to the courts for an injunction restraining Fulton from navigating the Hudson with his steamboat. Daniel Webster appeared as Fulton's attorney. He won the case and secured for the Claremont the full rights of the river. Fulton afterward built other steamboats, including a system of steam ferries for New York City. In 1814, he constructed the first United States war steamer. Before constructing the Claremont, Fulton was interested in canals and in the invention of machinery for spinning flax and twisting rope. He also made experiments with submarine explosives in England, France, and the United States, but these were considered failures. He died February 24, 1815. The first steamboat in the West was built at Pittsburgh in 1811, and within a few years after the first trip of the Claremont, steamboats were being used on all the leading rivers of the country. From the earliest times, men had sailed the seas, but their ships were small and slow and subject to wind, tide, and current. The success of the river steamboat led to the use of steam in ocean navigation. The first steamship to cross the Atlantic was the Savannah in 1818. The vessel relied almost as much upon wind as upon steam for motive power, but during the voyage of 25 days, steam was used on 18 days. The wood required for fuel left little room in the vessel for freight. With the advent of coal for fuel and better machinery, steamships grew in importance, and in 1837 two ships, the Sirius and the Great Western, crossed the Atlantic from Liverpool to New York with the use of steam alone. By 1850, the average time for a transatlantic voyage had been reduced to 11 or 12 days. If the old Savannah could be placed beside the Lusitania, the giantess of the Cunard line of ocean steamers, a comparison would demonstrate the triumphs of the century in ocean navigation. If you were to cross the ocean on the Lusitania or her sister ship, the Mauretania, you would enter a vast floating mansion 790 feet long, 88 feet wide, 81 feet high from keel to boat deck, and weighing 32,500 tons. Her height to the mastheads is 216 feet. Each of her 3 anchors weighs 10 tons, and her funnels are so large that a trolley car could easily run through them. The Lusitania has accommodation for 3,000 passengers, officers, and crew, and is driven by mighty turbine engines of 68,000 horsepower. The steamer was built at a cost of $7,500,000. She has traveled the 3,000 miles across the Atlantic in about 4.5 days, the quickest transatlantic voyage ever made. She moves through the great waves of the ocean with such steadiness that passengers can scarcely tell whether they are on water or land. A telephone system connects all parts of the ship. There are electric elevators, a special nursery in which children may play, a gymnasium for exercise, shower baths, and an acre and a half of upper deck. There are 5,000 electric lights, requiring 200 miles of wire. Wireless telegraphy flashes messages to the moving ship from distant parts of the world and bears back greetings from her passengers. A daily illustrated newspaper of 32 pages is published on board ship. That's it for today, guys. If you would like to suggest some changes or recommend some stories you want to hear, then comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.